Are we going to let these trespassers get away with their sneaky shenanigans? Do we let them steal the treasure and valuables which belong to the Angron clan by right? No! We do not!
A long time ago, the Dwarves came upon the mightiest mountain range of the world on their journey from the Southlands, in search of a new homeland from which to dig more tunnels and veins to mine minerals and precious materials. In the World's Edge Mountains, they found a new home. They mined and mastered the stone and ore, giving life to breathless rocks. Within the cold darkness of the bedrock, gleaming cities were carved, as if to reflect the stubborn nature and glory of their builders. Watchtowers and forts were built on the high grounds, gazing upon the snowy rims and steep slopes of the mountains for the ages to come. In their glorious days, the World's Edge Mountains belonged to the dwarf kin in its entirety, and its splendor was undeniable. Their kingdom, or the Karaz Angkor, as many know it, was full of architectural wonders and riches beyond the wildest of imaginations.
I see beside me brave dwarfen hearts. Such courage will imbue my rune helm. This is the day to strike many grudges from the Great Book.
A vast realm that is now shattered under the heavy burden of countless tragedies and unrelenting war, a pale shadow of its former glory. In this video, we will explore the Dwarf realms. Although many of their ancient strongholds now lie in ruins and have become the lairs of evil creatures, there are many others that still endure and remind the noble dwarves of the glories of the past. As the Golden Era crumbled away, a dark period known as the Time of Woes befell. Following devastating earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that shook the core of each and every dwarf city, foul creatures came out of their lairs to grasp the opportunity. From the deepest and darkest of shadows they came. Never before seen monsters, suddenly shaken and enraged, preyed upon the dwarves. With the start of the Goblin Wars soon after the natural disasters, orcs, goblins, trolls, and other dangerous creatures advanced towards the weakened holds, as if to gnaw at a wounded animal. Marching from distant lands, or seemingly arising from never-before-seen tunnels and dark passageways, tunnels of the partially destroyed underway became swept with foul skaven and goblins alike, as they attacked relentlessly at the noble dwarves. Before long, countless strongholds and cities were either abandoned by the dwarves or invaded and overwhelmed by enemies of all shapes and forms. It was a war on 1,000 fronts, a war the dwarves had not a chance of winning. With thousands of their people slain and ancient strongholds ruined, a thick mist of grief and despair set across the entire dwarf realms. Already stubborn and mistrusting, war and betrayals battered the hearts of the mighty dwarf kings. To protect their people and survive the ever-growing darkness of the convoluted world, the kingdoms shut their gates to the outsiders, with their gold, metal, and gems protected in enormous halls and vaults. The suspicious kings sat on their thrones, struggling to protect their own realms from total annihilation, never forgetting nor forgiving their grudges. Now, the dwarf strongholds are known to be sources of light and hope in a sea of darkness. But there are also many smaller settlements, mines, and outposts scattered throughout the World's Edge Mountains and across the wider world. These settlements are far humbler in size than the ancient glorious strongholds. Many dispossessed clans hope to make a name for themselves by fortifying their positions and dream of establishing a new stronghold worthy of the Karaz Angkor. Many other holds have fallen and are now destroyed, home to countless foul creatures. Many were destroyed during the time of the Goblin Wars, and their ruins litter the mountains. These include mighty holds that once were thought impenetrable and indestructible. The terrible earthquakes and the bloody wars against the many enemies of the dwarves have taken their toll on the mighty Dawi. Many of these holds are connected through the underway by a network of tunnels and passages that the dwarves have made over time. With the earthquakes, floods, and the ensuing invasions by Skaven and Greenskins, many of these passages have fallen, but many more still stay connected to each other. Let's begin exploring the many strongholds that make the Karaz Angkor, from the holds that still stand defiant to the ones that have already fallen. A treacherous road built through a winding mountain pass climbs to meet the mighty city of Karak Eight Peaks in the World's Edge Mountains. Hidden watchtowers manned with sharp eyes spy on the travelers long before they reach the formidable gates carved into the mountainside. A visitor's trek is hazardous, for the pass is haunted by a myriad of perils. May it be icy blizzards or ruthless foes hidden behind the next turn of the road. Children of the open skies are often mistaken to expect to find a kingdom claustrophobic and cramped beneath the earth. Yet, if an outsider is by some miracle trusted by the ever-wary dwarf masters, their eyes are met with the most precious jewel of the Karaz Angkor, the Everpeak, an impenetrable fortress, the main city and stronghold of the dwarf race. Behind the 400-foot-tall gates is a remarkable city the likes of which has seldom been seen by outsiders. Countless levels carved into rock, each connected with majestic bridges and stairs, hold a bustling city within. Built in the enormous chambers, thousands of pillars rise to the ceilings, adorned with shiny gems and runes, giving life to splendid and magnificent architecture. Beneath the busy halls, priceless heirlooms and treasures are hidden in the dark, behind the sealed doors. Laid within lavish tombs, bygone kings are remembered by their descendants, for there is hardly any other folk as loyal to their past as the dwarves. The strongest and the most enduring of all the dwarf cities, the everlasting capital of the proud dwarf kin, has never fallen to the hands of the enemy. Karak Eight Peaks is said to be the most fortified stronghold in the entire world. Strengthened with high walls reaching to the snowy peaks, its ancestral builders designed many defense mechanisms in and around the city. The hills around the gates hide engines that can cause avalanches, and even collapse the path of the enemy into the crevasses as deep as the root of the mountain. When the siege is dire, even the ever-watchful dragon sculptures engraved onto the gates are known to spit rivers of lava onto the invading army. All in all, it is the dedication and pride of Everpeak's inhabitants that won't surrender or give pass to the foes. Only but 2 times in its long recorded history, the gates were besieged. Yet, both times, neither the strength of the gates nor the determination of the dwarves yielded. Before the grim era of the time of Woes, the gates of Everpeak were never shut, and visitors of all sorts were welcomed into the majestic city. But once the dark shadows and phantoms grew large, the king at the time ordered to seal the main gates, to spare his people from the doom that could befall the mighty city. For many centuries now, the main gates remain closed to strangers, and only open for the king's armies when they march to war. Just as his ancestors before him, the fiery High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer rules the city without bowing down to anyone. It is him who now keeps and protects the great Book of Grudges, and has sworn to avenge all wrongs made to the dwarves, to bring back their mighty and noble race to the golden days of old. Although times are grim, and the great Book of Grudges is thicker than it has ever been, the High King believes in his heart that better days shall come when the ancestor gods smile upon their race once again. Days just like in the Golden Era, when the gates of Karak will reopen, and only the dwarves shall rule the glorious World's Edge Mountains once more. The inhabitants of the kingdom of Carrickdrag pride themselves in being the protectors of the Peak Pass, a long stretch of mountain roads spanning from the far lands of the east to the Old World. In the times of old, the pass was fortified solidly and connected to Carrickdrag through tunnels and passes. Serving the purpose of connecting the eastern and western strongholds, Peak Pass made it possible to trade and send each other aid in the times of need. However, since many eastern strongholds have fallen during the somber time of Woes and the subsequent catastrophes, the pass is now an invasion path for orc and goblin war parties. To the great fortune of the western civilizations of the Old World, Carrickdrag still stands as a barricade before the enemy flowing from the east like a roaring river. Guarded and defended adequately, the real strength of the city comes from its fierce dwarf slayers and their unmatched skills with the axe. The Slayer warriors are called upon and welcomed home in Carrickdrag since the days of King Baragor many moons ago. The king had taken the oath of the Slayer at a time of utter grief and had thereby become an important part of the dishonored cult of dwarves. The Slayer's oath is a binding promise that requires its taker to live in exile while seeking redemption by attaining the most honorable death, battling monstrous creatures. Only in glorious death shall the Slayer's oath be fulfilled, and any shame or dishonor removed. Torn between his kingship duties and his Slayer's oath, Baragor became the first Slayer king and passed down his legacy to his descendants who came to be known as the Slayer Kings. It is now King Ungrim who carries the responsibility of honoring the warrior god, Grimnir the Fearless, and protecting the people of his kingdom. Although besieged many times, Carrickdrag never fell into enemy hands and resumed the task of watching over the Peak Pass. Indeed, not only do the fighters of Carrickdrag defend the Peak Pass, but also ensure continuous trade that is the life vein of many cities and kingdoms. It is this flow of business that once transformed Karakradrin into the center of trade and provided the city with its riches. Not to mention the constant flow of dwarves from all over the world that travel there, decided to become a slayer. Standing at the western end of the Death Pass and neighboring Karak Eight Peaks, Carrickdrag was once one of the 3 strongest holds of the dwarf realm, mostly spared from the calamitous earthquakes that heralded the downfall of their civilization. The real tragedy of the kingdom of Carrickdrag came with the ensuing relentless attacks of the foul greenskins. After unceasing raids and full frontal attacks, the last blow that finally ended the dwarf reign in Carrickdrag came from the orc warlord Zogbab the Destroyer. By conquering one of the most ancient homes of the dwarves, Zogbad turned the kingdom into the largest and the most lavish orc stronghold, with the statues and sculptures of their hero gods and goddesses corrupted and altered into the vile orc gods. Crude totems that stood defiant against the rest of the world's edge mountains. The huge black granite fortress became a stinking monument of shame for the Karazankor. Attempts at recapturing the stronghold were made, but they all failed in the attempt. The dwarves paid in blood, and many lives were lost, as the place was always running rampant with greenskins and other hostile creatures. It took centuries before a living dwarf finally entered the long-fallen kingdom. The successful attack was led by none less than the current High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer, who wished greatly to revenge King Cazador and prove to the realms that his people would never yield. Thorgrim's army penetrated through the gates and slayed thousands of greenskins, including their warlord. Disturbed and deeply saddened by what he had witnessed in the chambers that used to be the home of his kin, Thorgrim sealed his lips and never said a word about what he truly saw in his expedition. Finally crossing a great grudge from the Book of Grudges, Thorgrim left the stronghold, still greatly infested with the greenskins, swearing that a mightier vengeance will come one day to those creatures that still reside there. Although successful in dealing a deadly blow to the greenskins of the place now known as Black Crag, Thorgrim returned to the Everpeak with a heavy heart. Functioning as the center of industry, Joofbar is perhaps more of a ceaselessly running loud machine than an architectural sight to behold. Almost fallen during the time of Woes, the city was ingeniously rebuilt and fortified to protect it against the many enemies that now continuously assail the dwarves. Joofbar is built and equipped with mechanisms that make it almost impenetrable, allowing the city to stand strong against the evil tide and sustain its industrial production. Home to the principal altar of the Dwarf Engineers Guild, Joofbar is a true gem of opportunities for the inventors to test and design heavy industrial machinery that is then produced en masse and sent to the many holds and dwarf settlements across the mountains and beyond. Certainly not constructed with the intention of disguising anything, one can hear the mechanical noises of the city echoing from miles away behind the mountain peaks surrounding it. The stronghold itself is built in a crevasse carved within the mountain by the deluge of a waterfall. The energy of the torrent is put to use through a number of water wheels and pumps that turn all sorts of rattling gears. Joofbar is truly the center of metalwork for the Karazankor. When night falls over the mountains, the chasm is illuminated by sparks of fire, powering the machinery that melt and forge all sorts of metals into impressive weapons and engineering marvels. The fame of the city comes especially from the weaponry created from gromril, the strongest and the most enduring metal existing in the world. In the past, the ore was mined from under the Karak Varm to be crafted into the most exceptional swords, shields, hammers, and armor within Joofbar. Although providing gromril became challenging since Karak Varm's fall. Many expeditions still take place to mine and bring the resources into the city. Looking over the Blackwater crater, the location of the hold enabled the dwarves to mine precious gromril and create exquisite weapons for centuries long. A lot of this gromril was taken to the city of Joofbar to be properly treated. Year after year, they delved deeper into the bedrock, until finally coming across the waters of the lake, and thereby weakening the foundation of their city. When the earthquakes hit the kingdom, the base of the city succumbed for the most part, and the flooding of the Blackwater crater was so rapid that none of the dwarves in the lower levels of the hold escaped. Remains of the inhabitants, along with hoarded heirlooms, were either washed away into the smallest tunnels or sunk into the depths of the lake. Finding opportunity at the time of Karak Varn's despair, packs of Skaven rushed to the city in the hopes to drive the surviving dwarves away. Unlike the dwarf kin, who valued gromril above any substance found within the earth, the agenda of the ratkin was different. Their eyes were set upon the green-lit warpstone that lay buried under the vast rocks. With time, changing influences and corruption of the warpstones spread along the veins of the city and spoiled the kingdom forever. Although the dwarves abandoned Karak Varn, considering it fallen for good and cursed, they could not leave the reserves of gromril behind. Engineers designed special suits to dive into the lake and the flooded tunnels, allowing regular expeditions to mine the star iron and collect their sunken treasures. These expeditions are considered heavily dangerous, and many have been lost, never to return. A once mighty hold, now fallen and shattered. These days, only treasure hunters and adventure seekers dare to dwell in the haunted ruins of Karak Asgal. The kingdom was so rich that it was known as Karak Izil, the city of jewels. Valuable heirlooms in hills of gold were stocked within iron vaults and were sealed with runes of hiding to keep them secluded from jealous eyes. The stronghold was incessantly attacked from below by the Skaven, while entire armies of greenskins raided the above-ground city. Following long years of raids by the Skaven that burrowed tunnels into the city, and the orc armies that smashed their gates with boisterous war machines, Karak Asgal was finally infiltrated by the enemy. Many dwarves lost their lives valiantly defending their homes. To the annoyance of the invaders, however, the farmed jewels of the city were nowhere to be found. The dwarves know a thing or two about protecting valuables, and they were prepared and determined to not allow their riches to get into the filthy hands of creatures such as Skaven, trolls, goblins, or pitiful orcs. The riches were well hidden. Enraged and displeased, the spiteful creatures marched further to other settlements to plunder, leaving the destroyed city in desolation and ruins. But even with the last of the kingdom's defenders dead and the invaders gone, Karakazul was not to be left alone. A dragon named Graug the Terrible claimed the ruins as his own lair and delivered any creature left in the city's halls a scorching fate. The vault sealed so cleverly by the dwarf rune lords was found in no time by Graug, for a dragon's nose smells the scent of gold better than anything else. The monster nested upon the vast amounts of piled gold and gems for many years. Countless heroes and hunters attempted to slay the beast and get a piece of the immeasurable riches that soon became a legend in the old world. But all died in vain. Finally, as the end comes to any creature that draws breath, it came for the giant beast as well. A dwarf called Skalf succeeded in taking the mighty dragon's life by cutting its throat with his axe, thereby becoming Skalf, Dragonslayer. Although Graug was slain, the dwarves were too few to properly reclaim the city and build the doomed kingdom back from its ashes. Instead, the greenskins grasped the opportunity and infested the once mighty hold once more, getting their filthy hands on the precious metals that were once hidden from them. It is said that the greenskins became so rich that trolls fed exclusively on gemstones. Rather than seeing more dwarf blood spilled in endless battles with the goblins and Skaven to take back the city, Skalf and his kin established a new settlement nearby. Today, Kargan Skalfson claims the kingship of Karakazul, but he does so while set up in a small fortress outside the main entrance. The stronghold has grown too dangerous to enter. Thousands of greenskin and Skaven lie there, but their fate has already been written in the Damaz Krog, and the dwarves will not rest until they take back what is theirs. As the last of the southern holds still under the rule of the dwarves, Karakazul stands atop the richest iron reserves of all the World's Edge Mountains. The armors and blades crafted by Karakazul's master ironsmiths are among the finest and the highest of value in all the dwarf realms. Invaded and besieged uncountable times in its history, it has endured like a solid rock against the numberless waves. The closest the kingdom came to a defeat was when the greenskins forced the dwarf warriors to retreat from the western halls and lower levels of Karakazul after countless unrelenting attacks. Only by sheer stubbornness and the unceasing flow of new and enhanced weapons, the dwarves finally took back their home after 10 long years under siege and many losses. Although not fallen, the hard, long battles took its toll on the spirit of the dwarves of Karakazul. The population of the kingdom grew thin within the fallen warriors, and the survivors were forever haunted by terrible nightmares and grief. Even the great King Cazador was not spared of the tormenting loss of his own kin in the hands of the orc warlord, Gorfei. The blind pursuit to avenge his family was finally realized when the High King Thorgrim presented King Cazador the head of Gorfang Rotgut and freed the survivors of his family. Eternally grateful for this action, King Cazador devoted himself to the causes of the High King fervently, rather than waiting for the cold claws of death and grief over his lost beloved ones.
Here come the foulest grudge makers of them all!
King Cazador has been spending every day of his life bringing doom on the enemies of his people. Karakazul stands defiant. The coastal kingdom of Bardvar remains one of the most exceptional dwarf holds. It is relatively smaller when compared to other dwarf strongholds, especially the ones that are built under the vast World's Edge Mountains. Built within the caves and cliffs of the vast mountain ranges and carved by the tides of Black Gulf, the city enjoys being the most cosmopolitan and perhaps the most welcoming of all the dwarf settlements. The enormous port witnesses a bustling traffic of trading ships coming all the way from Lustria to the Southlands. They bring merchants and goods of all kinds together in the city markets. Such network of diverse people and cultures keep the dwarves of the Sea Gates rather humorous and hospitable, and in turn easily distinctive of their cousins, who are somewhat known as grumpy and distant to the strangers. Although dwarves are not famous for their love of water, a notable portion of Karakdrag's population consists of capable sailors. The safety of the trading ships and the port is ensured by the epic fleet of Karakdrag that patrols the waters day and night from potential invaders. The respectable Sea Engineers Guild is located in the Kingdom of Karakdrag, and they are the creators of the remarkable ships of the Seagate fleet. In contrast to the wooden ships of other seafaring races, the dwarves sail with large iron vessels powered by steam engines. The heartache of every dwarf is undoubtedly the loss of the once glorious kingdom of Karak Eight Peaks. From the days it was first built during the Golden Age until its downfall, the kingdom rivaled even the Ever Peak with its beauty and riches. Hidden within a sunken valley, crowned by 8 majestic mountain summits, the glorious surface citadel of the kingdom sat atop the largest network of mines, overflowing with precious jewels and untold riches. Whilst countless attempts by foul creatures to conquer the city above ground failed due to its protection by the mountains surrounding it, the disaster came from the depths of the rocks so familiar to the dwarves. Crawling through the tunnels of the underworld, uncountable Skaven attacked and gained control of multiple underground levels and settlements. For many years, the dwarves contained the majority of the attacks. However, they were forced to retreat, one level after another, until the sole chance at survival was to abandon their home. With heavy hearts and promises of vengeance, the last dwarves abandoned their once mighty home, adding a significant grudge into the Damaz Kron. Subsequently, the chambers and the plazas became swarmed with bands of orcs, goblins, trolls, skaven, and many other dangerous creatures that lurk amongst the shadows, all battling amongst themselves for the ultimate supremacy of the once beloved kingdom of the dwarves. Blood is shed every day, above and beneath the mountains, in a fight for control of the damned hold. Over the long ages since the days of King Lun, who came to be the last dwarf king of Karak Eight Peaks before abandoning the hold, many attempts were made to regain the rule of the city. Yet, the swamp that spread into the kingdom from its deepest tunnels up until the citadel was too thick to clear. One after another, the descendants of King Lun lived and died far away from the distant dreams of their fallen home. Finally, after a time it seemed like eternity, Belagar managed to reclaim the citadel with the help of the High King and Thorik Ironbrow. Although the subterranean networks and chambers still belong to the creatures that were not meant to own it, Belegar's victory spread hope in the hearts of their brethren all over the World's Edge Mountains. There are 3 main factions fighting a cruel war of attrition for control of this vast hold. Queek Headtaker, the Lord of the City of Pillars and Warlord of Clan Moors. Skarsnik, King of the Eight Peaks, Chieftain of the Crooked Moon Tribe. And Belegar Ironhammer, leader of the Angrand clan and rightful ruler of Karak Eight Peaks. Constant warfare and unceasing attacks are part of the daily life in this place, for no faction is willing to let go of their hold on Karak Eight Peaks. Below the ranges of the World's Edge Mountains rages a bloody war that is far from over. Inch by inch, tunnel by tunnel, each step forward is paid in blood. So the battle drags on and on. Not a day goes by in Karak Eight Peaks without some plot, probing raid, ambush, assassination attempt, or full-scale assault. With every attack, tunnel invasion, or counterattack, the unforgiving warfare under the tunnels evolves. We will explore the ongoing conflict surrounding Karak Eight Peaks in a future video, but the fate of the Greenskins and Skaven that have infested the place is already written in the Great Book of Grudges, and the retaking of the mighty hold has been sworn by many living dwarves. The unexpected fall of the ancient kingdom Karak Ungor became the first great loss for the dwarves during the Goblin Wars. Prior to its downfall, the inhabitants of Karak Ungor relished the ores excavated from the deepest mines beneath their feet. Digging further down towards the heart of the bedrock, they eventually depleted some of the mountain's resources and abandoned most of the tunnels. The consequences of this action were not foreseen at the time, for there was no creature known to dwell underground, other than the dwarves themselves. After the mountains quivered with terrible earthquakes during the times of the Great Catastrophe, the passages and tunnels under Karak Ungor cracked, and many crumbled far from sight. Out of such fissures poured the night goblins of the Red-Eye tribe, filling the tunnels like rising water. All the while King Morik Stonehammer and his army were still marching to the west, and by the time they came back to the fortress city, their kingdom was far gone. Infested with goblins of all sizes and shapes, they had conquered all in their path, and slaughtered hundreds of the noble dwarves. Cut off from their home by the impenetrable walls and gates that they proudly built themselves, and the unexpected numbers of goblins in the Red-Eye tribe, the dwarves of Karak Ungor retreated to the neighboring kingdoms of Karakdrag and Joofbar. So was the mighty Karak Ungor taken from its builders and conquered by the filthy greenskins that called their new base the Red-Eye Mountain. The chambers where the statues of ancient kings once stood are now gory, stinking battlefields, where the goblins and the Skaven horde fight for the command of the city. When approximately 500 years passed since the loss of the hold, King Skorri Morgrimson led an assault to reclaim their rightful place. During the Battle of 1,000 Woes, the dwarves managed to cut down thousands of greenskins and got a hold of the southern valley and main gate. But unfortunately, they were unable to get into the citadel itself. The goblins of the Red-Eye tribe attacked relentlessly at the dwarves, and after many confrontations and sustained losses, the dwarf army was forced to abandon their attempts and return to Karak, decimated and in failure. Under a heavy sorrow and shame, King Scory passed his crown to his younger cousin, Rogny Stonehammer, and took the Slayer's Oath, leaving on his own to seek his destiny. It is said that he died shortly afterwards. Time has passed, but the real owners of the kingdom have never forgotten their home. 3 High Kings have been slain in their attempts to take back Karak Ungor. It is perhaps the High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer who will finally succeed in leading a dwarf army into the city and reclaim the home of his brethren. But to accomplish this feat, thousands upon thousands of greenskins and Skaven must be slain before even attempting to establish a hold on the once proud dwarf kingdom.
They committed blasphemy by turning away from the ancestor gods and practicing magic. Magic, I tell you. They are our greatest shame, and they will be dealt with in time.
Dwarves who left their ancestral home in the Southlands and journeyed north along the World's Edge Mountains. As time passed, they spread amongst the mountain, and over a period of many hundreds of years, they excavated cavernous underground cities, sank mines deep into the mountain roots, and constructed tunnels which carried them further north. A handful of them moved forward towards the east upon arriving in the Great Skull Land. The sanest of them all turned back west and followed the southern veins of the World's Edge Mountains to settle in familiar ground. A group of hardier ones headed further into Norska, where they established themselves despite the unforgiving weather and the proximity to the Chaos Wastes. Conditions were harsh already, yet there were a few exceptionally stubborn clans who ventured deep into the hostile mountains of Morn. With time and the coming of chaos from the north, in the event of the great catastrophe, the connection all these drifters maintained with their kin in the west grew faint and ultimately disappeared altogether. The dwarves of the east based their head seat in the city of Uzkalak, also known as the Place of the Skull. The rest of the dwarves of the Karaz Angkor believed their kin dead, lost against countless corrupted hordes and tribes in service to the Chaos Gods. But the dwarves that remained there, as stubborn as they are, resisted the tides. Yet survive they did, not as the beings they once were, but as something sinister, unseen among the dwarves of the old world. At an uncertain time, and perhaps for an uncertain reason, the dwarves of the East abandoned their ancestral gods and turned to the evil bull god, Hashut, the father of darkness, as they call that entity. Some say that this was their only way to survive the living nightmare of chaos that haunted them every day. By worshipping a being of utter malice and greed, the dwarves rejected the elder traditions and embraced chaos. From then on, turning into chaos dwarves and condemning themselves to eternal torment. What was once deemed honorable was forgotten, and the binding oaths were broken. Chaos worked a cruel change upon them. Desire of sovereignty corrupted their hardened hearts as their souls went astray. The magic users who were once the runesmiths were granted terrible magical powers, and arose quickly as the ruler priests of their condemned society. Advancing further than any other dwarf magic practitioner, the Demonsmiths mastered the ways of dark sorcery and bending the fires of hell. Driven by the thirst of power and superiority, the Chaos Dwarves created a nefarious empire ruled by cruel tyrants, unceasingly working factories that blew black fumes into the air were built all over the Dark Lands to fuel their war industry. Their traditional knowledge in metalworks and weapon-making were wholly committed to vile acts and agendas. To the dismay of their still honorable kin, the Chaos Dwarves adopted terrible practices, such as mixing the pinnacle of engineering with the seemingly unlimited power granted by the Dark Gods, resulting in terrible living engines of destruction that scream incessantly, seeking to destroy and devour everything they come across, emerging as smoking constructs from their hell forges, covered in black smoke. The war machines shake with demonic sentience, waiting for the darkest hour to come. We will explore the Chaos Dwarves in more depth in a future episode, as their lore goes deeper and many dark secrets await to be discovered. For now, we know that the temples once built to honor the ancient dwarf gods decayed within the chambers. Uzkalak remained bound to the rotten heart of this empire, the capital city of Jlewenhagen. The lower levels of the stronghold are permanently sealed shut and hidden from the curious eyes, for there are always terrible practices and machinations at work to punish the traitors and oath-breakers of the new corrupted empire. Long before the arrival of Sigmar, the Dawi were still green in their ways of rune magic. For long years, the secret guilds of runesmiths practiced the craft and experimented to master the art. Inevitably, the differences between the practitioners resulted in much tension, and they bickered with one another. There were some who favored caution and discipline, and some who wished to see how far they could push this unique form of magic. Not long after, the dwarves who longed to test the limits of their powers split from their brethren and traveled far up north, where the strong magical energy was abundant, yet untamed. During their journey, the departed clans first arrived in a dreadful place, where the winds blew dust from the ancient fields of bones. Troubled by the evil that still seemed to have a grasp on the unclean ground, they hastily left the plateau that is called the Great Skull Land. But a number of them remained. Some of the bravest amongst them chose to travel afar into the mountains of Norska and burrowed new holds for themselves. The wealthiest and the strongest of those holds was built atop an iron mountain that was then known as Karakdrag, the Dragon Hold. Settled atop rich reserves of sapphire and silver, the dwarves of Karakdrag prospered despite the constant warfare with chaos monsters, giants, ice drakes, and other nameless creatures mutated beyond recognition. After surviving centuries in the chaos-corrupted lands and being separated from their kin by great distances, the Norscan dwarves became further isolated from the rest of the world. Through time, their culture and language changed so much that their customs became unrecognizable to their relatives in the south. More often than not, the dwarves of the World's Edge Mountains compare the oddities of their estranged cousins to those of the Norscan men with whom they interacted often. Grim, as the barren mountains they occupy, and stubborn as the enemies they endure. Many who speak of this act unsurprised, for it is only but predicted to go raggedly mad, living so close to the chaos wastes, and neighbor the men who worship chaos. For centuries, Karakazul remained the capital of the Norscan strongholds. One after another, the great kings of the city welcomed the representatives of the other Norscan cities in their great timber halls above the surface. Important matters were annually overseen during the Feast of Grungni and the Althing of the Ancestors, where the kinship in the north was further strengthened. It was in the age of the King Thorgard Kromson, when the great war against chaos dawned on the world, and the darkness arrived. Realizing the urgency of the matters, King Kromson answered the call of the High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer, and joined his forces to aid Kislev in their time of desperation. After ages of separation, the near end of the world had brought the kings beside one another and their people closer. The oaths of alliances were repeated, and the rings of kinship were exchanged, to remember the common foe and the fight against the ever-encroaching darkness. Karak Eight was one of the few strongholds built in the unwelcoming territory of the Mountains of Morn. Its crafters were dwarves set on a mission to find the legendary Mountain of Gold, which was believed to be located eastward into the yet-to-be-discovered desolated mountains. During one of such expeditions, a clan of the fable-pursuing dwarves stumbled upon a mountain rich in minerals to mine. After deciding to excavate a new home for themselves, they axed and carved the bedrock, establishing the second largest dwarf stronghold in the Mountains of Morn. Their fortress was built strong and rigid to endure the spiteful creatures lurking in the mountains and the forceful blizzards. It is said that these blizzards were so intense and unnatural that they flung giant boulders against their walls. Their rune-inscribed gates were hidden and well protected against the enemies they were yet to meet. The terrible fate of the stronghold was sealed the moment an orc hunter laid his eyes on the city by sheer luck. The loathsome dweller lost no time to carry the word to none less than Thogub Smashclub, the ruler of the Angry Fist tribe. Although surprised by the existence of the settlement, the ruthless tyrant was neither a stranger to the delicious meat of a dwarf, nor to the treasures known to be hidden in a dwarf hold or settlement. Followed by his bloodthirsty and greedy horde of frenzied ogres, Thogub marched to the gates of Karak Eight. The city was smaller than the strongholds he had seen during his days in the World's Edge Mountains, yet Thogub was still met with the same dwarf mastery and defense. Failing to breach the doors and smash down the walls, the stubborn tyrant still refused to fall back. The siege turned into a battle of wills for many years, as the dwarves showed great resilience to the sway of despair. Occasionally, a small group of ogres would manage to find a weak tunnel entrance to crawl through, only to be slain at the end of a sharp axe by the furious dwarves. Finally, at the command of Thogub's Smash Club, the ogres captured and tamed 3 gigantic stone horns to use their brute force to blast the gates. The massive impact of the clash knocked down the main gate and sent the dwarf warriors flying across the courtyard. The ogre legions then rushed across the upper levels and sliced through the unfortunate defenders that stood no chance against the seemingly unstoppable wave of ogre infantry. On their way to the floors beneath the surface, the ogres had finally laid their meaty hands on the prize, which they thought was even better than the riches hidden in the hold. The glorious dwarf ale. The slaughter was quickly halted, and the ogres built a giant bonfire in the great hall of Karak in triumph. As the stolen ale was gulped, keg after keg, the roaring ogres roasted the still fresh meat of the dwarves on the sizzling flames. The black smoke of the fire soon reached the noses of the remaining dwarves in the treasure hall, where they stood on guard around their king, almost frozen in place from terror. The mortified warriors waited for the ogres to make their appearance. To their surprise, the ruler of the Angry Fist tribe left them free and carried on with the great feast. Confused and terrorized, the dwarves left their doomed home and ran along the slopes of the mountains to escape a terrible death. Thogub's Smash Club was delighted with the victory, and was certainly not growing merciful, for his intention was only as mischievous as it was to be expected from his kind. Soon, after the bellies were full, the ogres would go after the dwarves again. The rumors had it that the meat tasted better when infused with the fear of their prey. To the east of Karak dwarves used to dig for silver and other minerals in the deep mines of the Silver Pinnacle. The spacious rooms in countless levels of the mountain were promptly taken from them in one night by brute force. The new master, or rather the mistress of the Silver Pinnacle, was an unexpected enemy. A queen of deadly beauty who commanded an army of undead. The unexpected and swift victory of the Vampire Queen soon found a lengthy entry in the Great Book of Grudges, and in the hearts of the never-forgetting dwarves. After the fall of her birth city Lamia, Queen Neferata and her priestesses fled from the crushing forces of Alcatazar, and then from the tyrannical grasp of Nagash. For Neferata desired no master other than herself. Following long years of exile in the shadows of the old world, Neferata and her loyal followers of the Sisterhood finally found a new home within the thick walls of the Silver Pinnacle. The mountain became the shelter wherein Neferata would endure the coming centuries and pull the strings of many puppets all over the world in disguise. The dwarves would know her as the Queen of Evil. The sinister heart of the Queen desires many things of the world, but her greatest wish is to lead an empire of the undead from her seat in Lamia. Yet, Nehekara is still ruled by the Tomb Kings, and taking back what is hers demands the Queen's patience and preparation in the safety of her new home. However, if she were to wait in the gloomy chambers of the Silver Pinnacle, then the remnants of any dwarf resistance had to disappear. With the most ancient statues of the dwarf gods and goddesses demolished, one has to dig deep to find traces of the time of the dwarves in the halls of the Silver Pinnacle. There are only but a few chambers in the stronghold, where the sunlight shines through, and the rest seems to be covered with a thick blanket of darkness. Upon entering the dim rooms, lit with torches, one can smell the sweet scent of oils and strange perfumes. The mysterious and beloved purebred cats of Neferata roam the halls and the passages embellished with symbols in high Nehekaran, almost as if spying on the Queen's subjects. The undead wardens, fully dressed in black, patrol the courtyard and the corridors of the transformed city. Lamian women of extraordinary beauty and skill are invited to the Silver Pinnacle to be trained as the handmaidens of the Queen, learning magic, disguise, and manipulation to serve the desires of Neferata. The women who prove to be worthy of the Lamian sisterhood are allowed in this exclusive sect. Once fully trained, they are to leave the Silver Pinnacle and infiltrate kingdoms, courts, and ruling royalty to manipulate the world under the commands of the Queen. Others who remain as Neferata's handmaidens form the deathless court of the Silver Pinnacle. Their days are spent tending to the Queen's needs, teaching the ways of Lamia to the young bloods, and practicing their alluring techniques on the select few visitors of the city. As the true identity and nature of the palace, and above all, that of its queen, is to be kept secret, only a few naive knights of Bretonnia and some trading merchants with luxurious goods are granted passage. Those who are allowed to enter the mountain are bewildered to see the reflection of the ancient Lamia under the snow blanket that covers the peaks. In the occasions when the Queen herself meets with the handful of privileged visitors in her chamber, none can set their eyes upon Neferata, as her face is hidden behind 7 silken veils. Upon meeting the mesmerizing beauty of the handmaidens dressed in exotic clothes, some of the mortal men never leave the gates of the city. However, the disturbing rumors passed on in the villages and small settlements nearby are contradicted by the lucky visitors of the castle, who dismiss the superstitious fools. Instead, they spread wild stories of the rich and mysterious Countess of the Silver Pinnacle, and the feast she throws in the honor of her guests. Many fall for this bait, and willingly enter the realm of the evil Queen, only to never come back. The past of Vidawi is rooted deep within the mountains that shape the backbone of the world. Since the first of the dwarf kings were born from the rocks of the mountains, their bloodline traveled far and wide to conquer every mountain top. The enigma surrounding this mysterious kingdom sparks yet more wonder in the minds of the dwarf royals and commons alike. Aside from the mystery of its location, merely the existence of this legendary place is a subject of doubt. It is often in the good company of the fellow dwarves, or rather in the better company of a proper bugman's beer. One begins to talk about the lost riches of Karak Zorn. Whether these stories are true or not, the eyes of the listener shine in awe upon hearing about the underground city carved within a mountain of gold. Precious elements nested in the deep veins under the mountain are rumored to be so abundant that the dwarves of Karak Zorn supposedly used diamonds and rubies for their everyday currency. The gems adorning the giant ivory gates of the stronghold shone brightly upon the friends of the Dawi, while granting no passage to their enemies. Yet, nowadays, the doors are even invisible to the kin of their own masters. Karak Zorn is said to have been built by the dwarves, who left their ancestral homeland and journeyed far into the core of the Southlands. If this is to be believed, then this unique settlement was set upon the white-capped mountains, looming over the wild jungles that covered a vast tropical continent. Driven by the legends of old, more than a few embarked upon long and often perilous journeys to find the lost kingdom, all in vain. Ambiguous maps claiming to show the secret paths to the gates of Karak Zorn are still passed down and sold for a fortune. None of which suggest the same location, yet each different route inspires a new wave of treasure hunters who pay no mind to the warnings of the seasoned explorers. Far too many adventurers of young and fools brave the heat of the misty jungles and the icy winds of the mountains to never return home again. There are yet some who swear to have happened upon the hidden gates of Karak Zorn by sheer luck, or midst an expedition. but never again could they track their steps back. Such claims are almost always ignored by all but a few, for even the promising clues seem to lead to a dead end time after time. Some believe that Karakazul has existed in the past, but perished due to an unknown disastrous war, or a similar fate. Bordered by cursed and treacherous lands to the east and west, the dwarves of Karakazul doubtlessly endured regular attacks from orcs and other creatures unseen in the old world. Perhaps their paths crossed with the lizardmen of the Southlands. If so, whether this encounter was of friendly nature or not, is not registered in the books known to the dwarf lore-keepers. Assuming the settlers of Karakazul were alike their cousins, then they were most certainly curious and fascinated by the hidden city of Slatlan and the riches it held. If the lizardmen indeed have the knowledge of the fate of Karakazul, then the past shall remain uncharted.